Thursday, December 6, 2018, and this is a special edition of Views of the News. Normally, following that video open, you'd see me, Mike McKean, and Ernest Perry in our weekly roundtable on media behaviors. But not today. Today, we've got something a little bit different. I've spent this semester working with 8 students from the University of Missouri's Honors College. They're students who are interested in current events, politics, tech, and good storytelling. Some of them are journalism majors, some aren't. But what I can tell you, they are smart, they're passionate, and they have a lot to say. Enough from me, better you hear it from them. Here they are.
Thanks for that kind introduction, Amy. Before we get too deep into our conversation, let's start by introducing ourselves. I'm Ethan Brown. I'm a sophomore studying investigative journalism.
I'm Rachel Barron. I'm a freshman from North Texas.
I'm Ashley Dorff, a sophomore studying strategic communications.
And I'm DC Benincasa, freshman from Cleveland, Ohio. Go Browns. Seriously, I've been annoying these guys with Cleveland Browns talk every week we've met.
And we've been working with our 4 other classmates who are working as producers for us behind the scenes. Big props to Anna Spell, Caroline Fellows, Joe Butler, and Mary Catherine Davis for helping us do a lot of the research and writing for today's show. Mary Catherine brought this one to our attention. The 2 wildfires that raged through California throughout October and November caused unprecedented damage. Reuters reported that the Camp Fire, which burned in Northern California and killed 88 people, may have caused at least $9 billion in damages. California's Department of Fire Protection is calling it the most destructive wildfire in the state's history. However, statistics from Recode showed that the recent East Coast hurricanes received far more coverage than these wildfires. On September 8th, the day Hurricane Florence made landfall, news outlets published a nearly 9,000 articles about the hurricane. At its peak, only 2,000 articles about the wildfires were published. That's roughly 1/5 of the coverage Florence received. There are some theories about why this might be. One is that there's a geographic bias, as many national news organizations are located on the East Coast. Others say hurricanes create much more immediate coverage or footage for television news. What do you guys think?
Well, I think, first of all, some of it is due to kind of the nature of the natural disasters. Not that that's fair, but even though this wildfire in particular was especially quick burning and extremely destructive, it's not as quick as a one-shot hurricane that occurs in one day and causes unbelievable damage in just a few short hours. It is a slow burn, even though relative to other fires, it was a quick one. So I think news outlets having to do that extended coverage, maybe it didn't get as many resources as it should have.
Yeah, I also think that there's something about wildfires being a little bit more distant than hurricanes. When you see hurricanes, you think of towns getting destroyed. You think of roads being flooded. You think of houses being flooded. I think there's a distantness that's involved with wildfires where it's a little farther away than towns and civilization. So I just think that's less of a human factor in wildfires. So I think that's what makes hurricanes a little more appealing to mass media outlets.
Yeah.
And to go along with Rachel's point, I agree. You have to think about, what do the viewers want to see? Are they going to get sick of weeks of coverage of the exact same thing? It just doesn't make sense to me, because they're obviously both very important in national disasters, but I can understand as an audience that you go, oh, the wildfires again. Why do I have to continue seeing this? I want to learn more about something else.
Especially if you're not living on the West Coast.
For sure.
Yeah, what I was going to say, I mean, is there a larger problem here regarding the ethics of having to find the most shocking images or footage, or is it more, just finding what people want to see? How do you reconcile with that?
I think it's difficult because if you look at some of the images that came out of specifically the Camp Fire, because the Camp Fire was kind of unique in that it was in Malibu, a heavily populated area, or not even really heavily populated, but more heavily populated than other wildfires that have occurred. And there were some shocking images of houses that were completely destroyed and leveled, but I do agree that when you go to a hurricane, it's astonishing to think that that all happened in just a few short hours. So I think there is a problem with prioritizing something that's maybe a little bit more hard to believe or shocking than something that is still shocking. That's why it's confusing to me why the news outlets saw one as greater than the other in terms of shock factor.
Yeah. And Ethan, I think going back to your point about the East Coast bias, I think for wildfires that go on for weeks or even months sometimes, it's hard for media outlets on the East Coast to pour in that much money mobilizing reporters over that long of a time span. So I think that's where some of the East Coast bias comes into factor, whereas some of the hurricanes that have been on the East Coast, they've just been able to send reporters a couple blocks and cover this big national news story. So I think it's hard for national outlets to pour that much money into wildfires on the West Coast when it's dragging on for weeks and weeks. You don't know how long you're going to be there. So I think that's a dilemma that journalists face.
That's an interesting point. I hadn't thought about that, because you look at the one national outlet that was able to do it so cover it so frequently. It was the Los Angeles Times, and maybe it was just because they were closer and didn't have to use those resources. I always thought of it as a geographic thing, but maybe it's also a resource thing. It's an interesting point.
Yeah. And another thing missing alongside the wildfire coverage is the lack of attention towards climate change. Not only wildfires, but devastating earthquakes, crop failures, and rising sea levels have all arisen out of global warming. Here's an interesting number. According to the National Climate Assessment, the effects of climate change have doubled the area burned by wildfires from 1984 to 2015. The Trump administration released its report on this the afternoon of Black Friday, at a point when many weren't turned into the news. Though maybe that was the point. A number of Trump's transition team acknowledged their strategy, saying, do it on a day that nobody cares and hope it gets swept away by the next day's news. It also came days after the president tweeted, whatever happened to global warming? A giant team effort of 13 federal agencies and the White House, the 1,656-page report stresses the severity of climate change and the severe effect it's already had on our environment and our economy. The president offered this response to reporters who asked what he thought of the report.
I've seen it, I've read some of it, and it's fine.
They say economic impact is devastating.
Yeah, I don't believe it.
You don't believe it?
No, I don't believe it.
So, despite being released on Black Friday, do you think that this report had any effect on the global discourse surrounding climate change?
Well, I'm not sure if it had a larger effect in like a larger picture sense of it, but I do think, at least on my social media feeds, I think the fact that they tried to sweep it under the rug in this situation almost made it more publicized than if it had been released at a, when it was supposed to about a month later. Because the story changed from, this climate report, it changed to the fact that they were trying to sweep it under the rug, and it played into the larger narrative of this, the last couple years that have been, the U.S. starting to regress a little bit on its climate policies. So I think that I think it almost had a bigger impact because it was somewhat of a failed attempt to sweep it under the rug.
But what I wonder is if this new coverage of the fact that it was trying to be swept under the rug actually aided in it being swept under the rug, because instead of talking about the predictions that it's making that are very scary in some situations, they're talking about how it was tried to be swept under the rug.
Yeah, I think it just shows how far America is from addressing climate change. It's not fun to talk about, and I think until you get a determined effort from journalists, politicians, and citizens all together, it's not going to be enough to actually create change. I mean, the whole thing that the Trump administration has going on for them right now is this booming economy with the low unemployment. And when you start talking about climate change and rolling back government regulation for like oil companies and such like that deal with, that harm the environment, I think that's when it's always going to be more about the economy. It's always going to be more about the job. So I think it's not as much journalists' fault in not covering this issue as much. I think journalists need help. I think politicians and journalists alike need to drive this conversation. And until journalists get the help of politicians, it's not going to go anywhere.
Yeah, journalism's job is to be skeptics, and they're not getting any kind of support from the administration saying, oh, hey, it recognize that this is happening. We have what I would consider to be somewhat of a denial of what's happening. And I think that journalism is doing good in calling that situation out, but we also have to think about how we've covered climate change in the past. We have the stereotypical article of ice is melting, the world is going to end, or misconstrued statistics. And so journalism needs to do a little bit better job in saying, what is the real issue here, and how can we convey these issues in a very transparent and clear way to readers so they really understand the impact?
Well, and on top of that, I think talking about how we've covered climate change in the past is really important because we've also portrayed it as an individual issue. Like, oh, you turn down your thermostat, you're going to save a lot of energy. Yes, it saves energy, and it does, make a small dent in our carbon footprint. But you look at it, I mean, it's a larger situation where a lot of the pollution is coming from corporations. It's coming from larger scale things than just a single home or a single person. So I think we also need to be able to talk about the fact that, this isn't just, oh, you, the single person, can, turn down your thermostat, put on a sweater, and save the day.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because when people think of journalists covering the environment, they think of covering national disasters first, when maybe we should think more about covering what you're saying, Ethan, talking about corporations harming the environment consistently, little by little, every day. Instead, it's more, when journalists talk about the environment, it's more parachute journalism, talking about it when it's convenient, when there's not a Brett Kavanaugh hearing or Jim Acosta getting his press pass taken. I think journalists need to make a more determined effort to stay consistent with the environment, but also advocating for journalists a little bit. Is it exciting to talk about the environment for viewers?
Well, speaking of the Jim Acosta press pass, you know what I want to talk about? I want to talk about what's been going on in the White House press room. On November 19th, the White House announced a series of new rules for reporters for how they can question the president and the White House staff. It was the result of a lawsuit CNN filed after the White House pulled Jim Acosta's hard pass, a press credential that gives him more fluid access to the White House. The controversy that started it all was when Sarah Huckabee Sanders tweeted a doctored video that she and the Trump administration claimed showing Acosta supposedly smacking down a White House intern's arm. Will the new White House rules have an actual impact on how journalists do their jobs at White House press conferences? Is there a sincere threat to freedom of the press in the future as a result? Let's discuss.
So, I think that it's always a little bit scary when you see a reporter being shut out of presidential briefings. I think that most people could agree that we have a right to know what's going on in the president's head and what he says in those briefings. And so I think it sets a scary precedent, and I think it does have an effect on both the public's perception of what journalists are doing and what's going on, and just the overall journalist's ability to do their job, which I think is extremely important when it comes to the public discourse about what's going on in our country. So it's scary, I think.
One thing that I tend to think about when we're talking about this is sometimes I wonder how necessary the briefings themselves are, though. I mean, Sarah Huckabee Sanders does not hold them daily or even weekly like they usually have been in the past. They've been held on like very sporadic occasions. I mean, there was one when the child separation policy was happening. Every time there's a big scandal, there's a press briefing. But I wonder, I mean, could we be putting resources to a better spot? I mean, could those resources where we're sending reporters into this briefing room in this very structured environment, which, is going to get certain answers, but it's not always, it very rarely gets the answers that you're looking for when you're looking for the truth. I mean, could we be diverting our attention to different facets or areas within our political coverage of the White House?
Yeah, and Ethan, I think you make a great point, because I think Trump has created this adversarial relationship between the press and the administration. But I think the press is diving right into it. I think they're embracing this relationship, which I think is harming the country. I think Trump is playing into the egos of journalists, and they are they're disproportionately covering Trump and looking to slam him. For example, on Wednesday at George H.W. Bush's funeral, a man who's committed 40 years of service to this country, one of the top articles on CNN was about the cold interaction between Trump and the Obamas and the Clintons. It's appealing when CNN and other national outlets consistently look to slam Trump. It's appealing to his base of voters. It's giving his claims of a liberal media and fake news, it's giving those claims credibility. So it's harming the relationship between the press and his entire base of voters, and I think it's just making everything worse.
Well, then it's not. I don't think it's not my point, it's not to say that there shouldn't be an adversarial nature between the president and the press, or, you know, the government itself and the press. I think that's important, and I think that's necessary. The government and the press are almost never going to have the same, you know, goals in mind. But I do think that there's some of the pageantry of it that creates a form of a certain adversarial nature that isn't, that doesn't foster any, you know, gains for the press or any, yeah.
And I think I completely understand what you're saying. I think the press briefings, though, are still important because I think it's hard to pin Trump down or even Sarah Huckabee Sanders down, to really just have to sit there, and you may divert the question, you may work around the question, but you're going to have to say something to my question. And I think that in itself does still hold some value in this sort of political climate. And I do agree that in some ways, I think in the Jim Acosta instance, he was giving some fuel to Trump supporters' claims that there's a liberal media, that they're just trying to bring Trump down. But I also think that that's more about how reporters act in the briefing room, and rather than the necessity of the briefing room itself. And I think going forward, journalists just need to ask their question and try to get an answer. And of course, there's always going to be an adversarial conflict, like you said, but I think that's important, but it's also important that you're being helpful in those discussions in the briefing room.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, so the midterm elections may seem like they took place ages ago, but now, just last week, Mississippi elected incumbent Sidney Hyde-Smith in a runoff election. It was a race that for many represented an opportunity for the so-called blue wave to reach the shores of a deeply red state. Throughout the race, Hyde-Smith drew heavy criticism for her racially insensitive comments, including jokes about voter suppression and public hangings. In her victory speech, Hyde-Smith addressed reporters' unfair coverage of her comments and thanked reporters for causing Republicans to turn out like never before. What do you guys make of this? What do you think about the coverage surrounding Hyde-Smith and what people said about her comments?
Well, you know, I think that I'm of the opinion that some of the coverage of it was a little too much. Some of the coverage, I think, framed her comments too much as jokes. I mean, you know, yes, they were jokes. She was joking about, you know, not getting college people to vote. But also, we all know that most jokes have a little bit of truth in them. And I think in this case, you could see the truth in them. She's from this deeply red state that has a very, very conflicted past with lynchings and public hangings. I mean, we have to recognize that fact. And I think these statements, I mean, if they were entirely jokes and she didn't believe anything that she was saying, why would she make them in the first place? So I think that the media needed to do a little bit better of a job at saying, yes, she was joking. However, I mean, she said what she said.
Yeah, and I think Hyde-Smith, she was right about one thing. It helped Republicans turn out and vote. I think this relationship between the press and, specifically Republican officials is making Republican voters want to turn out. And whether it's, I don't think it's unfair coverage as much as it just ticks Republican voters off. You know, this idea of a liberal media and slamming Republican officials. So it's hard for journalists to determine how far to go in terms of questioning and criticizing Republican officials, because in some way you're spurring a Republican turnout or creating an ends that is partisan towards Republicans by criticizing Republican officials. Like, it's interesting. Just I'd like to know how journalists face those ethical dilemmas.
I think that journalists, I think they may have been a little bit out of hand on this. I think they have to weigh whether they're doing more harm than good, especially in a situation where their impact has a significant repercussions on the public. I mean, if I agree with pretty much what both of you guys said, I think that the coverage was a little I mean, I'm glad that they acknowledged that it was a joke, but it was a little bit I think they could have done a little bit better.
It felt tongue-in-cheek at times.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think that, especially after the news broke that she went to a segregationist school and she sent her children to a school that only had one black student in it and was designed that way, I think at that point, I mean, you have facts that show a history of this behavior. I think at that point you don't have to be as tongue-in-cheek. I think, as you know, in the end of the day, someone's going to be upset by the news coverage, but as long as you're stating the facts, that's okay. And I think what they should have done there is said, well, there was a previous history of this type of behavior, so I mean, this is just the way it is.
Yeah. Well, we've already talked about the damaged relationship between the public and the national media. Accusations of fake news and media outlets becoming more partisan has fueled this bad relationship. Maybe the way to repair it is by letting voters and citizens share their viewpoints and opinions. Vice News has sent Republican pollster Frank Luntz to different locations to facilitate conversations between Americans. Luntz went to Texas, having a conversation with 8 Beto O'Rourke supporters and 8 Ted Cruz supporters.
I'm a Beto voter. I will be. And the reason for that is because of the polarization right now. I don't agree with all of his policies. Absolutely don't. But I disagree with all of Cruz's policies. I disagree with the wall. I disagree with all of that. And I guarantee you, as a mother of 2 boys, that I would do everything illegal, legal, it doesn't matter what it is, to get my children into this country.
Luntz has also had panels discussing gun rights, former Alabama Senate candidate Roy Moore, and other topics. So do you think this type of citizen-generated content is good for journalists?
I love it.
I think it's awesome. I think that maybe one of the factors that are causing just average everyday citizens to kind of turn away from news media is that they feel like their voice isn't being heard, that there's no one representing them in the news, because a lot of times when you watch a half-hour show on NBC or CBS at 5:30 every night, it's just officials. Here, they're not going to be able to say, I feel like no one's saying what I want to say, because he is talking to average, everyday American citizens who also want their voice to be heard, and they can see themselves in those people that he's interviewing. So I think it's great.
I also think it's placed in a very neat package on YouTube or wherever else for people, especially young people or people that are new to voting, for them to be able to learn about the issues and about politics in general. And I think it's really important for them to exercise this freedom, this democracy, and watch these people interact in a really civil manner, which we haven't always seen, especially in recent years.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point about reaching out to young people in the media, because I think that's something that we need to be better at. I think, you look at who watches the news and who listens to the news and who reads the news, it's still a little bit older of an audience. I think stuff like this, you're going on YouTube, you're doing more stuff with social media, you're doing more stuff that's even more relatable. I think it's just a way to, and maybe that's stuff they've already been doing, but I think it's a way to remind young people that, hey, we're here to cover you too, and we're here to cover issues that affect you as well.
Yeah, and I also think young people are growing up in an age today where they're literally raised to think that the two parties can't get along. So it's also good to remind them that we can get along, different sides can get along and create change for the better.
You mentioned polarization, and I think sometimes it's hard interpersonally to have conversations with your peers and not ruin friendships. Here you can see a discussion going on that's helpful, and that's coming to a conclusion which is peaceful, and I think that that's a great thing for people to see too.
Yeah. Well, it's been more than a month now since Washington Post columnist and U.S. resident Jamal Khashoggi entered the Saudi embassy in Istanbul. What happened next, most people know. Khashoggi, a known critic of the Saudi government, was murdered on the orders of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, something the Central Intelligence Agency concluded itself. President Trump has held off on direct criticism of the Crown Prince, in part because relations in the region aren't exactly abundant for the U.S. However, in Congress, Khashoggi's murder has created somewhat of a bipartisan moment. A bill that would halt U.S. support for Saudi forces in Yemen passed through the Senate by a margin of 63 to 37. And look what Republican Senator Bob Corker said about the bill last week.
But I may now be willing to get on the Lee Sanders vehicle, knowing it can be amended, to figure out some way for us to send the appropriate message to Saudi Arabia that appropriately displays American values and American national interests.
Now, might I reference, this is Bob Corker, or a very Republican senator, getting on a bill with Bernie Sanders, who is probably one of the more far left-leaning people in the Senate. So do you think we've done a good enough job of covering the fact that this has become pretty bipartisan, at least in Congress?
No.
No?
I'm amazed. We have a bill that Republicans and Democrats agree on. Like, this is amazing. And I turned to CNN.com, and Trump's face and Khashoggi's face are there, talking about how the administration isn't acknowledging this. This is an amazing moment. Think about the last time that a bill is moving this quickly. I mean,
a bill of major, a large bill, yeah.
Yes, between two parties. I mean, I can't even think of the last time since I've been engaged in the news this has happened, but instead it's Trump and Khashoggi's face right on the top at CNN.
Well, and then one of the things, I think if you want to talk about how the media can better approach Republicans who feel like they have been a little disenfranchised in the media, I think it's talking about maybe covering this divide between the GOP and Congress and Trump himself, because I mean it's they have very stark positions here and they're not the same.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it deserves more coverage. I think if it's a positive thing that's going on, and I think a lot of people are looking for positivity in the news, especially political positivity. I mean, that's something that, as you said, we don't come by very often. So I think covering it would, as you said, be a great way to bridge the divide between Republican candidates in the news.
Yeah.
After a shooting in its middle school last spring, Noblesville School District decided to make changes to protect students' safety. One strategy the district considered was social media monitoring, where the district would be able to search social media using a software that would scan students' posts. Ideally, the software would pick up on any possible threats to the school. However, there have been concerns that monitoring students on social media is a violation of privacy. Additionally, some software could cost thousands of dollars for the district to use. The district proposed and passed a $50 million referendum in November and plans to use that funding to improve mental health programs and safety. What do you guys think of this idea?
Well, I get where they're coming from. I really do. We've seen in recent years with mass shootings, we've seen social media posts that we probably would think should have been removed immediately or flagged in some way because they hinted at things that were going to happen. But like any technology, it has its flaws. And I just don't think that the technology is there yet to be able to flag every single suspicious post, and then will wrongly flag posts that are not even wrong in the first place. I mean, we've seen this already with Tumblr announcing its ban on adult content. People have been going crazy on there because all of their regular posts have been flagged as things like nudity and all these things that they aren't. And so I think it could cause the exact same problem. $50 million is a lot, especially on something that maybe won't even do the job.
I completely agree. I think that there has to be steps taken in high school. I mean, last year, you know, like we were in high school, and I remember that there was a level of fear about what's going to happen and could this happen at my school. And so I think that social media monitoring is a good idea, but I think there's a way to do it. And I think that at least at this point, as you said, technology isn't the way. I think harboring a community where students feel comfortable coming to administration about troubling social media posts is a more effective and definitely more cost-effective way to make sure that students aren't posting things that are problematic. At the end of the day, it's the students' peers who know what they're like and if something is out of character. And so I think that harboring that kind of community would be a lot more effective than this.
Well, and the other thing I think about is, I mean, how do you determine what they get to monitor? Is it stuff that's posted during the school day, or is this software that gets to go into these students' accounts whenever? I mean, that seems to me like a clear invasion of privacy. And look, I know schools have the right to regulate speech in certain situations, especially if it causes a substantial threat or impedes the school day itself. But it seems like the specifics aren't exactly rounded out yet. I mean, I don't know how I feel about a software that might be able to flag posts that I made even outside of school. And I get that it's for the public good, but I also, think that people need to have their right to privacy, or their right for certain people to see what they want them to see.
Great conversation, guys. Amy, back to you.
Aren't they great? I hope you've enjoyed their discussion as much as I have. I'd like to thank RJI's Travis McMillan for helping me to direct and produce today's special edition of Views of the News.